It's Christmas. Thank you, Jenny and Dan and choir. My, what a beautiful piece that is. Wonderful. Wonderful, isn't it? Let's turn to Luke 2, chapter 2 and verse 7, and I just want to look at one verse this morning which I think symbolizes the entire story of the birth of Christ. It tells us so much. If you read the entire several chapters found in Luke and the chapters in Matthew about the birth of Christ, I think this one verse summarizes, for the most part, the things that go on in that time. Chapter 2 of Luke and verse 7 says this. It says, "And she," meaning Mary, "and she gave birth to her firstborn son, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn." Let's read that again. "And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son." Now that's the first bit of information that we have there. We knew that was going to happen. We knew she was pregnant. She wrapped him in cloths. That's something we didn't know. Why? Because he hadn't been born. And then number 3, she placed him in a manger. Very important fact. I'll tell you more about that in a little while. Placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. The fourth important fact. No room in the inn. The title of my message today. No room in the inn. I don't know about you, but one of the things that I treasure most about Christmas is the nativity scene that we put out on our counter or on our buffet or wherever we might put it in the house or under the tree. There's one back there in the foyer. I've always treasured that because that's the depiction of the entire Christmas story. You know, you've got Joseph and Mary and of course the baby in the center. And then you've got the wise men or the kings, whichever they were. I think they were kings, but I'll tell you why at a later point in time. And you've got the shepherds standing around, and you've got the animals, and usually you have a little star above it. Just a complete scene of the birth of Jesus Christ. I remember very well when I was a young man, very young, and we didn't have one in our household. And I wanted one, and we didn't have much money, so I went down with my mom one day, and we found one, and it was just a little, probably about 4 inches wide and about maybe 3.5 inches high, and it only had Joseph and Mary and the baby. That was fine. That was all I wanted. And I treasured that little manger scene about so big. I still have it today. We put it out every Christmas. But today we've gotten more elaborate. We've got wonderful manger scenes, and they're inexpensive. Nativity scenes, we call them, or crutches. There are a number of different titles for them. Sometimes they're the statuary like we have back there. Sometimes it's a painting. Sometimes it's live people. I know some churches put on a live nativity scene at Christmas, and people go out and stand in the cold and make a sacrifice to spread the gospel, the good news, the joy of Christmas with those who don't know it. Mary and Joseph watch over the baby as he sleeps, of course, in the manger. The straw is always fresh in our manger scenes. I don't think it was at the birth of Jesus Christ, most likely. The cattle and the sheep and whatever other animals. Linda thinks there's a cat in there. I don't think there is. I don't think God would allow that. And the donkey watches over the entire scene, that probably the donkey that brought Mary to Bethlehem in that day. But you see, that manger scene has become inflammatory for some, hasn't it? Sad to say. There are some people that don't want those scenes in public places. They go to court over that. They bring lawsuits. And we Christians take offense at that, rightfully so. But that's another story we won't go into today. But I would say that these nativity scenes, these crutches that we have today, bear little resemblance to what really went on over 2,000 years ago when Jesus Christ was born in that little town of Bethlehem. I would say that. Nothing, I think, would be as beautiful at that time as we make it appear today, and we should. Have every reason to do that. For example, we don't believe that the shepherds and the wise men were there at the same time. Why? Because of the story of Christmas, the story of Christ. The shepherds came immediately, or virtually immediately, after the angels told them, and saw the babe. And then it was sometime later, of course, when the wise men or the kings came. I better clear that up right now because you'll be wondering about that. But the reason I think they were kings is several. There are several reasons. Jesus, you see, has been announced as the King of Kings back in Isaiah, 700 years before. So I think God would send kings to worship the King. That's one reason. The second reason is I don't think that wise men, and usually they would have been astrologers. That's what most people think, theologians. Astrologers, follow the sun, the moon, the stars, and all those kind of things, but I'm not sure that they could be trusted with precious things like frankincense and gold and myrrh. I don't mean that the wrong way, but those were precious and expensive commodities. And they might have been. I'm not going to demean that. But in my mind, I think they're probably kings. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to try to make a case for that. But what's wrong with this picture that we see where Jesus Christ, God, comes to earth, God's only Son, comes to earth and comes to this lowly stable? No room in the inn. Well, I think that most of us would have to say that Jesus doesn't seem to belong there. It doesn't seem like God should be born in a stable, in a feeding trough, with nothing but animals around to observe. Just doesn't seem right for some reason. He's the Son of God, and he's come down from heaven. He doesn't deserve to be treated like a vagrant, you might say, or even worse, perhaps. He deserves the best the world had to offer. But he doesn't get it. He doesn't get that. God, in my mind, our minds, I think, God could have done better. But God had a purpose and a plan. I'll get to that in a minute also. Suppose you were God. Think about that. I always like to play this scenario. Suppose you were God, and what if? How would you have handled it? If this were your son that you were going to send into the world, how would you do that? Well, being God, I would think that, as I've said before, not the first time, I would have put him on a white charger or something like that, sent him down with legions of angels and grand entrance and all that sort of thing. But I'm not God. We're not God. God knew what he was doing. No question about that. God always knows what he's doing. You don't fool him. No question whatsoever. Would you have him born in a stable, in a manger? Maybe not. Why was there no room in the inn? God could have provided for that. He could have found another inn or something like that, perhaps. God didn't want to do that. He had a plan. He had a purpose in this. Maybe we need to start and look at the town of Bethlehem where Jesus was born. Think about that for a little bit. I mentioned last Sunday at the end of the service a little bit about Bethlehem. I talked a little bit about it. I talked about a gentleman, L. Phillips Brooks, that went there and wrote the beautiful hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem. And I mentioned that he rode a horse. He rented a horse at that time and rode into this little town of Bethlehem. And you can do that today. You can go there, and if you're in Jerusalem, which is where most people go to because it's a big city, and really almost all of the major events happen in Jerusalem. If you go there, you can rent a car, or you can take a tour bus, or you can walk. You can walk. It's only 6-7 miles, something like that. Maybe in a couple hours you'll get there. That's all it takes. And you'll come to this small town of Bethlehem, still a small town, grown bigger since the time of Jesus, I'm sure, but it's still a small town. In the time that Jesus was born, it was comprised primarily of just merchants and some shepherds and maybe a few farmers and things like that, but there weren't many people that lived there. Oh, little town of Bethlehem was an adequate and apt title for it. And why did God choose the town of Bethlehem? Why? Because it was the home place of David. It was where David was born. And we know that Jesus is descended from the line of David, and of course David is the one that God always appoints and points to when he talks about the lineage of Jesus. He's so proud of the lineage that goes back to the time of David, because David was a remarkable man in every aspect. This small Jewish village known as Bethlehem. Well, this is the reason that God selected that. You see, God had sent his messenger over 700 years prior, another messenger in the form of Micah, a prophet. And Micah had prophesied this about the birth of Jesus. He said this in Micah 5:2. He said, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah," that's a hard one to pronounce. Ephrathah, that's to distinguish it from other Bethlehems which were in the nation at that time. "Though you are small among the clans of Judah," he says, "out of you will come one for me, one who will be ruler over all Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." And what he was saying there was that Jesus had been around as long as God had. Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit date back to the very beginning, in the beginning, and even before then. The Bible starts in the beginning, but that's talking about when the creation took place. God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit had been there throughout all eternity. And that's why he says he is from old, from ancient times. And you see, there's another reason that this all occurred, because the Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, had pronounced the fact that he wanted to have a census in the land. He wanted everybody to come and register in their hometown because he wanted to take this census. And the reason behind that was the fact that he wanted to extract more money from all the population. Rome needed a lot of money. Rome was a huge empire. Same problems we have today, roads with infrastructure, with the roads, with the aqueducts, with the monuments, all the things that they had to take care of and maintain. They needed more money. So if you have a census and have everybody go register at that same time, you can extract a tax from them. And that was the purpose of it. All the Jewish males had to return. And because Joseph was born in the same town, Bethlehem, as David was, he had to go back there to register with now his wife Mary. And so God, you see, had arranged all these events to put them in place. He had arranged the tax by Caesar Augustus. He had arranged the fact that Joseph had to go back to his hometown, to Bethlehem, at just the right time, with his wife Mary, who was probably 9 months pregnant, about to deliver. And they were exactly where Micah had predicted, had prophesied, had promised this would all take place. In Bethlehem, Ephrathah. That's where it was going to happen. It didn't just happen. God had ordained it, had planned it, you see. But there was no Holiday Inn in Bethlehem at that time. There was no Comfort Inn. There was no Hampton Inn. There was no any kind of inn of the nature that we have today, the modern day facilities that we have. And the only inn or inns that were there were all filled up. Why? Because there were a number of other people who had been born in Bethlehem too. Probably weren't many, if more than one inn in Bethlehem, small town. But again, when when the emperor ordained that people and commanded that people had to go to their hometown to register, that inn would fill up fast. And here comes Mary and Joseph. Mary is probably riding on a donkey. We don't know for sure, but riding on a donkey. Why? Because she's pregnant. She's about to deliver. She can't walk for 90-some miles from Nazareth all the way down to Bethlehem. So she's likely riding on a donkey or some other animal of that nature. And just as they get there, of course, is what we know is when she's going to deliver. But the first order of business is for Joseph to go up and knock on the door and ask the innkeeper, do you have any room for the night? Well, no, the rooms are all taken. I'm sad to say, he says. But he sees Mary, and he sees Mary is in a childlike way. She's about to bear her firstborn child. And he takes pity on her, I would say. We don't know exactly what happened. Most likely that's the way it occurred. And so he says, well, I don't have any rooms left, but I've got a stable out back. You could kind of make a place there for her, because obviously there's no other place in town. Usually they know, innkeepers know, and hotels know what other hotels are booked and so forth. And you could use some straw, get some new straw, fresh straw, and put that down. She could probably be all right there for the evening. See, travel in those days was dirty, difficult, tiring, really exhausting. If you travel 6 or 7 days, which it probably took them to come from Nazareth to this town of Bethlehem. Creature comforts just didn't exist for the most part that we know today. There was no private facilities available. Travel was dangerous. There were robbers along the way. There were wild animals in some cases. It was a dangerous time, dangerous place. Indoor plumbing just didn't exist. The animals that an innkeeper would own, and he may have owned some, but even if he did or didn't, chances are he owned a few that he would, quote, rent out. Why? Because it's like a hotel today. If you go and stay in a hotel in a distant city and you don't have a car if you fly there, you have to rent a car or some means of conveyance to get around. Same was true in that day. They would have to have some animal, whether it was a donkey or a horse or a camel or whatever, that people could, quote, rent and go wherever they wanted to go, and then, of course, bring it back. Or, like Mary and Joseph, they had brought their own animal from Nazareth, and obviously you have to put that animal somewhere. So he had a stable out back. All the inns in that time did, in addition to the animals that he may have had. The animals, you see, were going to be part of this scenario. And we have them. They're a major part of our nativity scenes that we have today. The animals play a prominent role, don't they? They were likely the first ones to observe the birth of Christ, besides Joseph and Mary. They were likely the very first ones to see that. Jesus deserved better, could have done better, we say. But could he? Did God want that to happen? I would say no. I don't think he did. I don't think he did. Because he wanted his son Christ, the Messiah, to be born in a setting of humility, in a setting of humbleness. He wanted him to be like the common man, if you can say that. Do you think that Jesus, who died naked on the cross, should be clothed in a velvet robe when he was born? No, I don't think so. That would not have been appropriate. Throughout his entire life, he really, in retrospect, was not much more than a peasant, if we can say that about the God of the universe. He lived the life of a peasant. He had only the clothes on his back. Only the clothes on his back, wherever he went. And nothing is more fitting, I would say, for a Savior than to be born in a lowly stable in a lowly manger, because he'd laid aside all the glory, all the prestige that he had back in heaven. That was all put aside. He was the king of the poor, the helpless, the downtrodden. I thought about this as I was preparing the sermon. You know, in the military, the commanders that are most sought after and the most cared for and the most loved are the commanders that get down with the troops, that relate to the troops. I think back to World War II, which I've read a lot about, and people like Eisenhower and MacArthur and Marshall and Patton were beloved commanders. I'm sure Dan can tell us a lot more about that. Simply because they related to the troops. They got out in the field with the troops. They didn't care much for the ones that stayed behind the desk. They wanted to see them face to face out in the front lines. That's what Jesus did. That's why Jesus came. He was on the front lines. And by being born in this condition that he was offering an invitation to the poor, the rejected, to the mistreated, the unloved, the disparaged, the forgotten, the overlooked, and the lost. To those who had no other means. You see, if he had been born a king, it would have been a lot different, wouldn't it? Would have been a lot different. He probably wouldn't have ate with tax collectors and sinners. He probably wouldn't have gone there to do that. He had to be born like he was, in a stable, in a manger, I would say. Born in poverty and contempt, in the indifference of humankind. That's the way it was. But a baby born in a stable, in a feeding trough, is God's greatest gift to humankind, greatest gift to us all. That was Jesus. Philippians says this, Philippians chapter 2, says, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Think about this. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Summarizes who Jesus was, doesn't it? He made himself nothing. The lowliest of the lowly is what that's saying. Nothing about him appeared to be supernatural, even though we know he was, in hindsight. No halos, no angels that we would expect with a holy figure, with God, the Son of God. No royal robe, no ring, no scepter. Just a baby born to a poor couple, young couple, that had traveled a long way to Bethlehem. And yet all of it was planned by God from the very beginning. God knew this was going to happen. Even back in the book of Genesis, where God talks about him being born as the seed of woman, meaning he would be born human like us, just like us, in the flesh. What do we learn from all of this? I would say a number of things. God uses adverse circumstances sometimes to show us who we are and to make us realize that and remember that. Sometimes they make no sense at all to us, but they do to God. They do to God. In some ways, no room in the inn may seem insignificant to some, but it's not insignificant in the big picture. Giving birth in a stable must have been off-putting to Mary and Joseph when you think about it. Any normal couple, when you go there, travel this long distance, you arrive at a place that you think you can find a room and you're told, nope, sorry, there's no room here, but you can go out back and you can fix a place out there with some nice straw and things like that. This is a man and a woman who had been visited by an angel. Think about it. Mary, you will bear the Son of the living God. Gabriel had said. Think about that. So she was no doubt thinking about, my. She was a very humble girl. She gave thanks to God. She proclaimed a beautiful song to him, Mary's song. Joseph, who had concerns about the fact that she was pregnant, was visited by the angel and reassured and told everything was going to be all right, that God had taken care of this. Don't worry about the way this is playing out. Just be patient and persist. How could they see that this was part of God's grand plan? They probably couldn't. Probably had no idea. It's just like us. We don't know what's going to come around the corner tomorrow, do we? We don't know what's going to happen. We think we do. We hope so. We plan, prepare. But there's always the unknown, the unexpected. That happens. That's what happened to them. Here are the things I think that are important about this. God is a just and merciful God. We know that. God is a God of love. His ways are not our ways. But most importantly, he makes no mistakes. God makes no mistakes in anything he does. He knows what he's doing. The world did not have room for Christ, just as the inn did not. John says this in John 1. It says, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. He came into this world to his own, to the Jews. And his own Jews did not receive him. They didn't believe him. They didn't believe in him. They wanted to kill him. They came home to his people and they wouldn't take him in. In the same way there was no room in the inn. They knew he was coming. God had told them that over and over and over and over through the scriptures in the Old Testament. He promised the Messiah would come. He just didn't say how or when or under what circumstances. Even these pagan kings or wise men or whatever they were from the Far East that came to observe this King of Kings came following a star. But his own did not receive him, didn't recognize him. The same would be true today, I think, if God chose to send his son today, and of course we know this is just something that's not going to happen, but if he came today, he would likely be turned away from the hotels in Washington, D.C., or right here in Dumfries and Triangle area. Same thing. He wouldn't be born up at Centera or Stafford or down at Mary Washington or up at Fairfax. Be born somewhere in a remote setting, wherever it might be, maybe in a tenement building, maybe out in the field. Think about it. That's comparable to what happened pretty much at that time. They'd have the same reception. Jesus, you see, throughout his life had, as I say, nothing of significance, only the clothes on his back. The clothes on his back. He said this to his disciples. He said, you know, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests. But the Son of Man, me, I have no place to lay my head. He was saying, he wasn't commiserating, he was just saying factually, I'm an itinerant preacher and healer, and I happen to be the God of the universe. But he was never flamboyant about that. Never made a big deal of that. He owned nothing except the clothes on his back. And when he was crucified, the soldiers there at the scene of the cross gambled for that robe that he wore. Think about that. Someone has said that we worship a God that was born in a dumpster rather than in a palace. That makes it hit home, doesn't it? But that's pretty much what occurred. That's pretty much the way it went down. He came from outside, to reach the inside. Look at it this way. We would be reluctant to go into a royal setting, into a palace, to appear before a throne. But we can go without hesitation to a manger. Can we not? We would do that in a heartbeat. That's why he was born in a manger. Not to be pretentious. If he had been born in New York or Paris or some other major city today, it just wouldn't fit, just wouldn't work. God knew that. Oh, little town of Bethlehem, that's the place I want my son born, is what God was saying. And that's the place where it will be. Think about all the things that went on. We wouldn't be as attentive to the Christmas story if these things happened. If they drove down from Nazareth to Bethlehem, Mary and Joseph. If they stayed in a Holiday Inn or a Comfort Inn or the Ritz-Carlton or whatever it might be, we wouldn't be comfortable with that. If they were born in Washington Hospital Center or Fairfax Hospital or some other equivalent hospital, had a team of doctors surrounding them, which they would have, Jesus would have, we wouldn't feel comfortable with that today, would we? If a crown was placed on his head and a royal robe and a ring and all those things, we wouldn't feel comfortable with that, would we? If he attended the royal events and things like that and hobnobbed with the king and queen and had constant media attention, which he would get today, the media would be all over this. We wouldn't be comfortable with that. There was no room in the inn because God ordained that. No room in the inn. Here's the important question for us today. Is there room in your heart for God today? Is there room in your heart for Jesus Christ? That's the question we have to ask ourselves, every one of us. Have I invited him in to my heart? Is he here? Is he here now? And you may have done it years ago, and you may have accepted him, but you may need to reconstitute that, revisit that, refresh that, recommit that. Is there room in your heart today? We're going to stand and sing a hymn of invitation. I would invite anyone here today who wishes to acknowledge Jesus Christ, to welcome him into your heart, to make him part of your life, to make him the Lord of your life. We're going to stand and sing this wonderful hymn, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, invitation hymn. If you wish to do any of those things or wish to come and pray or have a word with me, I'll be standing here. Let's stand and sing this beautiful, beautiful hymn.